Hey everyone, welcome to the channel, All Things Middle-earth here with a video talking about Season 7 and whether or not we think it should include the Kingdom feature that we see in Season 6. So let me know down below what you think. I'm going to share my ideas of what I think needs to change to make it viable at all, and some changes I think that could make it still interesting and somewhat new while keeping a mechanic that I think has a lot of potential. So let me know down below, but without further ado, let's get into the video. Now, if you have not seen my video, I'll link it up above. I did a video, more of a rant video about Season 6 and the balance issue that a majority, I'd say 9 out of 10 servers are seeing a pretty big imbalance where you go to the leaderboards and look at the different groups. Pretty much the top 5 are all in one group and they group up pretty quickly and servers end up finishing really, really early. Again, check that video out if you want to. I posted like several map examples of all the Season 6 servers. You get to see time and time again where things got rolled. That has not been the case in our server, which I'm very, very thankful for. We've had a very good season so far. Perhaps we'll do a recap soon of our situation thus far. But we do have one group up here in the enemy kingdom at 300,000 higher production. We have 4 of ours, 4 of theirs, and then a bottom one here. And again, a lot of these end up starting to get really close. So I think it's about as balanced as it could be. I do think these shuffled around a little bit in the last like week or so, but for the most part, we're pretty locked in here, just being in the top 10. So I'm very happy in my experience, but that's not been the experience of a lot of people. Again, lots of screenshots, lots of maps that are completely one color. But as you can see here, looking at this one, I hop over here. In terms of territories, it's looking very, very even. Now, territories do not mean everything in this game anyway. We're in a good situation, but this is not the norm. So I want to talk about 3 things that absolutely need to happen for me to even consider playing the Kingdom feature again in Rise to War. Now, as we mentioned, my server has not been the norm in my experience. So one thing that would absolutely need to change for Season 7 to contain or possibly consider having a Kingdom feature would be the balance issue. And I've suggested a few things in different videos, but I want to talk about a couple here. The first one would just be to have smaller kingdom sizes. Right now, there are 5 kingdoms, or there are 2 kingdoms in this group with 5 fellowships each, and that's kind of it. There's really one other group that had some size, but then they start getting smaller and smaller and it kind of drops off. So if, for example, they were to drop the kingdom cap to say 300, that would mean in this server that there would probably be 3, almost 4 kingdoms. And if there was a shuffle like that, you don't know how things would change, and there could end up being more options for people. So I think having 3 kingdoms would allow for more active kingdoms, so it's not just a 1v1 that as soon as it tips enough they just completely tilt, because that's kind of what seems to be the case. They start off pretty powerful. If there is a second one, it just gets rolled right away. So I think lowering to about 300 could really change how the dynamic of the kingdom system could work in a future possible season. Next up would just be more players per server. Again, in this situation we did have 500 per, like I mentioned. And if they have 8 rings of power and it's supposed to be 500 people per kingdom, they're just not putting enough people in servers to get anywhere close to that. We have 2 out of the 8 kingdoms that are full, and there's not even close to enough to fill up another one. So if they want to keep this number, they need to add more players into service. And I would even actually suggest that they take the last point, they reduce kingdom size to about 300, and then they still continue to put more players in. I think people would agree bag end is boring. I'd rather sit in bag end for an extra week if that meant an extra 2, 3, 4 weeks in my season, because most of the time servers end up finishing really quickly and you sit in here for, you know, up to like 6 weeks sometimes, depending on what side you're on, winning or losing. Because if you win, there's nothing to do. It's not fun. If you lose, same thing, but it happens a little bit sooner. So I think they need to add more players per server, even at the expense of more time in bag end. As much as I hate to say it, I think it would be worth it. And hey, maybe that's where they look at adding some different features in bag end, like a sandbox mode, that make it a little bit more fun to be in there and something people enjoy doing. Now, something else I would like to see as a change for the Kingdom feature, as you can see here, we're trying to hold off at this tunnel. Had some really exciting stuff happening over the last like 12 hours. As you can see, I'm sitting here on this tile. We have a lot of purple around us. I don't really understand why other kingdoms that are in your other fellowships that are in your kingdom have different colored tiles. This is the same feature as if you were in a faction with someone. I did cover this in another video as well, but to me, if you're forming a kingdom, it's like a very close-knit relationship. I feel like you should all be able to work off of each other's tiles. I don't see a real issue with that. Again, we're just still having to really over-coordinate to make sure each group has a spot. I get it. Just because you're in a faction with someone doesn't mean you're necessarily working together. But I will say in a kingdom, that's like a different level of your fellowship, not only forming itself, but then choosing to work together in a smaller group. So I think we need the same colored tiles within kingdoms. I think that would make it very interesting and a lot easier for the 5 or possibly in the future 3 groups to play together. So those are 3 things I think need to happen. Like that would be, if those things happen, I would consider it. I do think there's some excitement with new seasons and people like new stuff, but again, there's no point in doing new stuff if it doesn't work. So I do think we need to have a hard conversation with the devs, if they're listening, to say, hey, look, we'd rather play the same thing that's improved than have a new thing that's broken. So I do think there could be slight adjustments to Season 6 that could make it a little bit different. While they're still working on like the mechanic side of it, like the balance side. So the first thing would just be, this might be kind of obvious, but again, you start with the Numenorian quarters and the Eastern quarters. I think it'd be very interesting if they just switched that and it was 2 different types. So every season there's a new featured starting barracks. So that could be elves and orcs or urukai or dwarves or whatever it is, just a combination of those things. I do think that this is kind of restrictive. So I don't know. I don't love how restrictive it is because I don't really use a lot of the Numenorian quarters except for the Swan Knights. That's just me personally. But you're really limited to just, I'm doing my evil men and my Swan Knights basically at this point, and then everything else is off the hiring queue. So it does put some pressure there. So maybe there could even be a third one, like maybe that's a happy medium, is 3 kind of groups. I don't know. Or adding in here, you know, giving us a few more options for conscriptable troops. So whether that be new units or you decide, you know, since it's men, could you put some of the Rohan men in here? Obviously, there aren't more evil men. But if it's like there's the Angmar orcs and there's the Mordor orcs. And so we could have a bigger selection of orcs, let's say, and then a bigger selection of men. Not that I think we should do men again, but you get my point. I think if they just, you know, not only shuffled around who we have and maybe added a little bit more options, that would definitely help kind of balance out the stress on the conscription queue, because it is pretty brutal. Now, something else with the kingdom features, there are the kingdom rings, obviously. So if you look here, you can see there's the kingdom rings. They have the different buffs here, and there is no difference if you click through like in the different abilities. You just see the different rings you have. They're nice different colors. That's great. They do reduce the cooldown of your abilities by 2 hours each. I think it'd be very interesting if each different ring had a slightly different ability. Now, it would have to make sure it's something that is really thought through so it's not imbalanced, but it would make different areas tactically, you know, worse or better to go for depending on what your group is doing. I don't know. It would just be interesting as we capture them if we had a little bit of variety. But right now, it's just 2 hour cooldown, which is not insane. Obviously, if you have 5 rings and your opponent has 1, you're gonna use your ring buffs a lot more, which is very, very good. But beyond just the quantity and time reduction, there is no real benefit or change. And I think it'd be very cool to allow that to be part of the strategy. Again, for us, when we were trying to plan our season, we really wanted to start over here just because of the hireable units around and the mobs and location, all that stuff. We ended up not starting over there because we were not sure who was going to be up there with us, but it was just kind of based on location and like mobs around, and over here was a lot less favorable in my opinion in terms of like what mobs are around, what hireable units were around. So if there were different factors that played in that were, you know, different types of ring buffs, I think that could be something that people could think of and choose. Again, if you don't really care that much just jumping in, you might not be thinking about where your group should start, but it could be kind of fun for those that are interested. So I think different ring abilities for different kingdoms could be kind of interesting. And lastly, a slight adjustment that I think could be interesting as well, on the note of just kind of changing slightly, we have the scout towers in the game. They add a durability effect, which is very, very nice. And if you look at tiles, especially in regions that have multiple scout towers, the tiles, the HP gets kind of ridiculous. So if we go to Seldwyn Vale, for example, it has 2 scout towers here, and as you can see, my tiles here have 16,000 HP, so it's 3,000 extra per, as opposed to see a room that doesn't have a scout tower at all. It's just a 10,000 there, and then an area like Greater Rune's going to have up to 19,000 on tiles. So really making it difficult for enemies to take tiles in certain areas, which is really cool. But it would be interesting if they added different features for different scout towers. Again, there are some regions that don't even have them. Some have a lot more than others, and so I think it would be interesting if there were kind of strategic differences between the different scout towers that maybe even had like a bonus effect just in that specific zone. So depending on where you're fighting, you get certain bonuses. Just another thing to, like, as you're looking at the map and trying to strategize, to think through how the scout towers are going to affect your team and what your kingdom's trying to do. I think it would be interesting, but again, I'm not 100% sure. They may drop the kingdom feature. I feel like they spent a lot of time in season 5 with the elite units, and that got dropped. I don't think there's a plan to revisit that. And that was, I think, a pretty hefty change with elite units. I think the kingdom feature is an even bigger change. And so to me, it seems like a waste to continue investing all these resources in these new types of seasons for them just to be one-off. So I'd like to see them stick with something and just keep improving it. as opposed to like the just kind of major one-time changes. But again, those are just my thoughts. I think there are definitely, like I talked about the first 3 points, we need certain things to happen to make it viable. Balance is the biggest issue. And I think it would be nice if there were minor adjustments to things we already have to make it a little bit fresh, a little bit new. That way it's not a complete just replay with the exact same mechanics. So that's what I think. Let me know what you think down below. I'd love to hear if you have had a good experience in Season 6. Again, I do think our server has been relatively balanced, so I've been very happy with it, but that's not been the case in a lot of servers. So let me know what you all think, and I will see you in a future video.